Hi, my name's Nicola McGowan, as most of you know, and I'm the Principal Social Worker for Children's Services. Thank you for joining us. The aim of today is to introduce the neglect strategy, which I think that probably most people, if you're in the frontline team, have already seen the neglect toolkit and the neglect matrix, but probably much less of you have seen the neglect strategy, which I've only written and completed over the past few weeks. We don't have hard copies, though we do have hard copies of the neglect toolkit and the matrix. So the neglect strategy can be found on single source. If you go onto single source, and put in neglect, there is the neglect strategy, neglect toolkit, neglect matrix, all in one spot. And what's good about the electronic version is that I have been updating, in particular, the neglect toolkit. So the copy that is on single source has got some new stuff in it which the hard copy doesn't have. Okay, some of this stuff is really basic that I'm going to go through before we start talking about the toolkit, but I think it's really important when we talk about neglect that we're all coming from the same place, and we have to, in order to do that, we have to go over some really basic stuff. And also, I think that if you're more experienced practitioners, I would really like you to show this recording to less experienced practitioners if they're in your team, and so it's always good to make sure that they've got that basic understanding. When we're talking about neglect, we in children's services, in most local authorities, we use a definition that's laid out in working together. And so in working together, it talks about it involving the parent or carer failing to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, including abandonment, failing to protect a child from physical and emotional harm or danger, failing to ensure adequate supervision, including the use of, a whole bunch of dodgy babysitters that often happens with the families we work with, or kids getting lots and lots of accidents, lots of admissions into A&E. It may also, and this is the one that's the most tricky for us, it may, in terms of evidencing, it may also include neglect for unresponsiveness to the child's basic emotional needs. So again, this stuff we all know about it, okay, but I just really want to hammer it home that thinking about what neglect looks like, and this is in particular neglect that is at a level 3, level 4, so you're getting at the more severe end of neglect. Neglect looks like children that have got really severe and chronic health problems. So that may be that they're really super obese, or that they've got faltering growth, they've got a particular small stature, and actually they're not particularly coming from a family where they're all small. It's actually really something that is not organic. That they've got dental or optical problems, those children that we have where they're 5 years old and we're removing their baby teeth because they're rotten from drinking too much Coke. Which is, as we know, is getting a lot of publicity at the minute, but that's always been a problem, I think, all through my social work career. That they're slow in reaching developmental milestones, that they've got really significant speech and language delay, and again, that this is not organic, that this is due to lack of stimulation, poor parenting, lack of opportunities to develop. That they've got a delay in their development of gross and fine motor skills. So, for example, you have babies that are just stuck in the pushchair all the time. They're not given an opportunity to lie on the floor, to push themselves up. They're not given the opportunity to use arts and crafts and develop their fine motor skill movement. You've got children who've got really extremely disruptive and challenging behaviour. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, because we know children with extremely abusive behaviour themselves, it's often a result of disorganised attachment, and I want to talk about that and the connection with neglect in a minute. You have children that are really isolated from their peers, which starts to really compromise their social development, and that is a massive problem, especially as they approach adolescence and adulthood, and has a sort of long-term impact. There's poor hygiene, manifested in physical difficulties, including chronic knit infestations. We had a young child approaching teenage years recently who was hospitalised because of his knit infestation. And then you have these children that have upset stomachs. children that are young carers themselves and have inappropriate young carer responsibilities. They're looking after their siblings. And all of these factors, and Research in Practice has got a really lovely tool that looks at children that are subject to CSE and the connection with neglect, and they visually map that out. So for example, if a family is homeless, they're exploited in terms of people that are going to exploit them, offering them a place to live. They're exploited in terms of having no mates at school, which is a result of neglect. So there's so much interlapping there that I would like the more experienced practitioners to have a look at that resource. If you're interested, let me know and you can't find it and I'll send it to you. I think what we do, because we are always looking at throughput of our cases and trying to do a good piece of intervention, encourage self-efficacy with our families and move on to the next real pressing case, that sometimes that forces us to look at the more short-term to medium-term implications of children that are subject to neglect. And sometimes what our assessments and our thinking fails to look at is the long-term impact of neglect, and we have to really concentrate on that when we're doing our assessments. The long-term impacts obviously is already what I've said about relating to relationships and social development, but the NSPCC has gathered all different kinds of research and has clearly mapped out that actually chronic neglect has a strong connection between post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, the kind of adult mental health presentations that we normally connect with incident-led abuse, such as sexual abuse, really serious physical abuse. So we need to pay attention to that when we're thinking about the impact of neglect. Why do families neglect children? Well, that is, as we know, that nearly every single family that we're dealing with, as this is again really basic, but it's good to remind ourselves, every family that we're dealing with has had themselves pretty much have had a traumatic childhood themselves. They have got, and therefore, especially with those really entrenched neglect cases where no matter what you do, no matter how many skips you put in, how many community family workers or key workers you put in helping to tidy up the house and give them those household management skills, it just doesn't sustain. And that's often because they have no internal model themselves of being parented in that way. Where you get up in the morning and you wash the dishes and you wipe down the sides and you put a wash on while you're making the kids breakfast. They haven't had that experience. It hasn't been ingrained into them. What is more concerning is our parents that have had extreme traumatic incidents happen to them where they are, in order to emotionally survive themselves, they cannot connect to their child's experience. And I talk about this a lot in other areas, but that they misattribute children's behaviours for the wrong thing. And because they can't connect to the child's experience because they're dealing with all their own stuff, they then are not able to have empathy for the child sleeping on a very soiled bed, going into school with the kids telling them that they stink, their teeth rotten. And when you're dealing with those kind of families, it doesn't matter how many skips you put in, it doesn't matter how many times you go and do a deep clean in their house, that is not going to resolve itself until we get to the nut of the trauma and start to do some work with them. And in order to do that, we've got to do relationship-based practice. You knew I'd get the relationship-based practice in somewhere. Okay, but what we do know is that sometimes you're dealing with neglectful behaviours that are temporary. So it may be as a result of a family going through crisis because of a bereavement, parental separation, loss of employment, and when you're dealing with those kind of cases, you've got a lot more to work with, and you can, it's not such a long-term intervention that's required. And so, like I said, I think we have to keep on. I was talking to some schools, DSL, safeguarding leads yesterday about this. That, it's really important that all professionals understand that often neglect indicates a breakdown in the relationship between the child and the carer. And I think that's in particular prevalent as well with adolescents. There's a big, in the Neglect Toolkit, the Children's Society talk about a big piece of research that the Children's Society did, where they talked about that in particular for the 14 and 15-year-olds feeling that they had absolutely nobody to talk to in terms of problem solving, that as they got older and more embedded with their peers, their parents were stepping back. Okay. So we've developed a East Sussex neglect strategy and operational practice guidance that sits next to the, that needs to be read alongside the neglect matrix and the neglect toolkit. In this strategy, so it provides an overarching strategy for all early help practitioners and social care practitioners, and for people that are outside of the sector and working with children. In that neglect strategy, it gives you a lot of detail about responding to neglect across the continuum of need. It looks at the continuum of need and it talks about parental behaviours, parental neglectful behaviours, and what impact that has on the child's development. And it talks about the kind of families that are in level 2, level 3, level 4 of the continuum of need, and gives a much more detail about what that is than the neglect toolkit does. It also talks about how to do a really good assessment and the care planning process, which you will find in the neglect toolkit, but it also gives lots more detail about step up and step down. It provides guidance on the use of chronologies, and so it provides more detail on the use of chronologies as we normally use them. In the toolkit, I've used a particular tool which is a bit different from the chronologies we normally use. And in the strategy as well, I go into a bit more detail about culturally competent practice. Put this in the wrong slide. That should be, I'm going to have to delete that one. Sorry, I thought I'd deleted it and I hadn't. Okay, the neglect matrix for practitioners. So actually, I think Michelle, you're in the family support team. I think that most of you are actually probably in longer term teams. I'm not sure if there's anybody that's on the duty team. So you may not have seen the neglect matrix. It's been practitioners in SPOA and duty and assessment team, and early help practitioners and now the schools that have been shown the neglect matrix. What the neglect matrix does is lays out, it uses the assessment framework. So it talks about parental capacity. It has subheadings of parental capacity. Now everybody's going to test me on this. What's the assessment framework? Parental capacity, family and environment, and the child development. See how to do the triangle to remind myself. So it has those subheadings, and under each of those subheadings, it lays out the continuum of need and gives specific examples of what a family situation may look like that requires a response at level 2, that may require a response at level 3, or may require a response at level 4. So for example, you're looking at physical care, you're saying that at level 2, basic physical care needs are provided but maybe could be improved. Level 3, 4, you're looking at inconsistent availability of food in the house and maybe irregular meal times and routines. So maybe sometimes the children are coming to school a bit hungry, they're eating late at night, they may be having McDonald's now and then, nothing wrong with that. But then of course you're getting into level 4, and this is when it's actually starting to become heavy end child in need or child protection concern, where you're talking about cupboards being absolutely empty, there's food is decaying, children are going unfed. So throughout the neglect matrix, we're really trying to help people to think about where this sits on the continuum of need, and to give a bit more granular examples of what that might look like. So for example, we would look at safe care. So if you're looking at level
2, you'd be looking at maybe inconsistent supervision, maybe if they're an adolescent or an older child, that the parents aren't always completely aware of where they are, up to level 4, where, you know, the kind of families that we are dealing with, which is that the child is sustaining injuries whilst they're playing all the time, they're falling off play equipment, you know, the kinds of kids where we have, actually we were talking about one of these, we had reviewed a large neglect case the other day, and the child was got knocked over by a car, and actually interestingly, all of the serious neglect cases that we are dealing with often involves children getting involved in motor accidents. We talk about emotional care, and then we talk about environmental as well. So, for example, if it's level 2, housing conditions aren't completely great, there's cramped living conditions. Actually, I think level 2 and level 3, 4, sorry, I've got mixed up there, I need to amend that. And then you've got level 4, where actually the child's parents are sleeping in the living space. That's a familiar story, isn't it? Several children are all in one room, there's inadequate beds, the base is really broken, the bedclothes are torn, the mattress is soiled, and that really starts to paint the kind of picture of the families that we're working with. I think it's in particular helpful for these, the neglect matrix for people that are working outside of children's services, when they're trying to make some decisions about whether or not it warrants children's services involvement. What I'm saying to the schools and others is that it's not a tick box exercise. You don't tick all of level 4 and then you think, woohoo, we're going to get it into social care, or it needs to be used in line with your professional judgment. Okay, now I want to talk about the neglect toolkit. So hopefully most of you have seen a neglect toolkit and are working with them, but this is just really, I suppose, a really brief reminder about how to use the tool. So what is in the toolkit? There's a section at the beginning that talks about how to use the toolkit. There's a section on common issues, and that talks about drift and stuff. There's a section on assessment. Then there's a section on different tools to use in terms of establishing a baseline and measuring progress. And there is a section on cultural competence, planning and intervention, and review. And under common issues, which is probably not the right title actually, and this is why I keep on making amendments to electronic copy, under the common issues is a really good section on, and the electronic version has a better section on it, on working with disabled children with neglect, and also working with adolescents, because there is a slightly different approach you take with working with adolescents, and it's even more fundamental, built around relationship-based practice. But there's some good approaches we talk about in the toolkit. Okay. So throughout the toolkit, there are practice expectations that sort of underpin the use of the toolkit throughout. And that there is an expectation that when you're writing up your family assessments, whether or not you're in the duty team, or you're in the frontline, in the family support team, you're in a LAC service, wherever you are, that when you're starting your assessment, that you're drawing up an assessment plan which outlines the areas that you need to know about, but also what tools you're going to be using in terms of doing an assessment around neglect. At the first core group or family support meeting, or even if it's a LAC review and you're looking at neglect, you need to agree what progress, you need to agree what the baseline is that's been established for your assessment and your use of your tools, and how and when those tools are going to be reissued in order to measure progress. It would be really great if people could start to think, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, about using the goal attainment scale in when they're working with particular cases, because it really, really forces an alignment between practitioners and how they want to see the family situation improve, and what the parents' views are of what's going on and what they think needs to improve. If we don't get that alignment, it's really, really rare for us to secure fundamental, long-standing change. other practice expectations that are sort of interwoven through the toolkit is that we have got to be, and I say this all the time in terms of relationship-based practice, is that we've got to be really mindful that simply telling families to change their behaviour doesn't result in them changing their behaviour, especially with entrenched neglect. And I know as a practitioner myself that I would sometimes resort to that we have got to use relationship-based practice. And if we're not dealing with families, it's really hard, isn't it, especially when you're dealing with really gross neglect situations. I know that you've probably come across this, but I've worked with families where there's been like feces all over the walls and, you know, just rotten food everywhere, and you just can't help but think, how can a parent allow their child to live in that situation? But if we don't treat them and find some way of establishing some kind of respect and empathy for those parents, they never in a million years are going to accept our safeguarding concerns. So it's really important that we somehow form an alliance with these families. And that's where supervision is just fundamentally important. Those really entrenched neglect cases really get to you, and you've got to process the impact of that work for really, really good supervision. When you are working with neglect cases, often it's hard to find that common ground, or you're feeling that nothing's shifting and the case is drifting, and mentalisation and motivational interviewing questions are really, really effective in particular in these kind of cases. And that's why we're commissioning David Shemmins to do some training for us in the new year around using mentalisation. I would really encourage people to do some reading up about it, to attend the training, but I do talk about mentalisation briefly in the practice, in the neglect toolkit. Ooh, okay. It must look really weary poking the screen all the time. Okay.
Did you want anybody to put in any comments?
Yes, if there's anything that anybody is wanting to ask or wanting some further information, if you could write a wee message, and my lovely assistant, Leslie, will read it out to me. And so, yeah, if you, do them as you go along, and then I'll stop intermittently and see if there's anything that you guys want answered or more information about or whatever. Okay, so in the neglect toolkit, there's the beginning section talks about assessing and measuring progress. So as I say, the tools are to help us to assess what's going on with the family, but also to establish a baseline that we can then reissue those tools to measure progress. Now, I am a million, and as we all agree, I think most practitioners that I talk to were not into manualised approach to practice. We're not into prescriptive that, you've got to tick all these boxes and then you're neglected or you're not neglected. We are using these tools to support our professional judgment, okay? But also some of these tools really are very, very helpful in getting the granular assessment, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. I think I'm going to talk about it in a minute, actually. See if I've got the right. I'm sorry, I've cut and pasted the wrong assessment, the wrong slide, so just bear with me. Okay. Sorry. I was doing lots of cutting and pasting before I started, and I've mucked it up a little bit, but bear with me. So when these tools that are in the toolkit are really good at establishing an assessment, and I'm going to go through them in a minute, but they're a day in the life of the child, a cumulative neglect chronology, parenting daily hassles. What I haven't got a copy of here in this presentation is the home conditions assessment. Now, a lot of you are probably familiar, especially if you're as long in the tooth as my fine self, with some of these tools that were originally came through the Department of Health when the assessment framework was first launched, which was a long time ago. So lots of these have been around a long time. The home conditions assessment tool is really good in terms of trying to distinguish between a home condition that's a bit dodgy and a home condition that's absolutely hazardous to the child's physical well-being. It talks about the strengths and difficulties questionnaire and the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7, which are mental health screening tools that are used, as you'd be probably quite familiar with them in terms of working with SWIFT. Other resources which I'll talk about are the child chart and the parent-child observation table. Detail I just wanted to emphasise again as well, which I know you know, our practice in East Sussex is really good, so this is just reinforcing our good practice, but that our assessments have got to be really child focused with clear descriptions of the daily effects of living with neglect. Now sometimes when practitioners are pressed or they're relatively new, I've sat on care planning, for example, and I've had two probably equally concerning neglect cases, and I've had one assessment in which there's been relatively bland statements made about the child being exposed to unsafe living conditions. And then I've got another assessment that talks about a toddler crawling through dog feces and there being a Stanley knife and dishes in the unwashed dishes in the sink, and being taken to school with different people every day. Now that is going to get a response much more so than a bland assessment that doesn't give the description of the daily life for children. And I know that talking to a number of you that are experienced in court settings will get much better at putting those in statements, and the response from the judiciary is much more proactive when we talk about the daily lived experience of living with neglect. So in the toolkit there is obviously we talk about chronologies, we know about chronologies, they're really important in terms of identifying patterns of concern, emerging patterns of concern. They're also really important in terms of identifying times, things that are good, times when things have worked, we know this. But accumulative neglect is really damaging. It's even more damaging, I think, in some ways to some other forms of neglect, but it's really difficult to evidence. And in particular, if you're getting to the stage where you're wanting to get into court, and of course the court is incident-led, isn't it? So and it has to be an immediate significant risk of harm, whereas of course what we're talking about with neglect is long-term harm. So there's a really good tool in the toolkit which helps you to identify those repeat patterns, and I think will be particularly helpful if you're at the stage where you're about to go into court. Really important that we maintain, and I was harping on about this with the schools yesterday, that we have a multi-agency chronology, because often we have one particular profile of the child, somebody else has another particular profile of the child, and when you put them together it's much more worrying, or actually it might ameliorate some of those risks. So we have got to be very insistent that all people that are working with this child are sharing a chronology, write it down and share it with us. Having a good understanding of parental capacity to change is absolutely essential. You know, that if we need to make decisions about children not remaining in care, we need to make them quickly in order to get the best outcome for kids. There is a link to a tool in the toolkit, which is around parental capacity to change, and it is it's a tool that Vicky Ellis found, and we used a lot actually in our legal workshops, but we weren't able to publish it because we couldn't find the author. And then one of the newly qualifieds actually suggested this. I did a plagiarist check using the text, and it came up with the author. So now we have the author for the press, so we can publish it, which is fantastic. So there's a link in the toolkit around a really good tool that looks at external motivators, internal motivators, and the environment. And it's like a chart. You literally fill out where you think the family is, and it's a real good visual mapping exercise about thinking about where your targeted intervention has to be. So I would encourage you to look at that. Okay, this tool is a tool called A Day in the Life of the Child, and if you don't look at anything else, look at this and use this. It's really simple, and it is often done with the child, and it's where you're talking to them about what does it look like when you get up, what does the clock say when you get up, does someone help you get up, does somebody else help you get up, what time does it happen, who makes your breakfast, do you have breakfast, what kind of food do you have, do you dress yourself, does somebody else dress yourself, do you have hot water, are you able to clean your teeth? How does it feel to go to school with your teeth dirty? Does somebody take them to school all the way to evenings? And do they have an evening meal? What time they go to bed? Where are their parents? All of that kind of stuff. And it really fabulous in terms of giving you a granular picture of what it looks like in the day-to-day experience of the child. Did we get any messages, Leslie?
No.
Okay. Parenting Daily Hassles. I love this tool. It's absolutely fantastic. And again, it really focuses on the areas that we should be doing some intervention with. And often it's quite surprising. So I've done this tool with my own children, thinking about my care of my own children. It's really easy to score. And the toolkit tells you how to score it. And you do it with the parent. And what I found really interesting was actually, I thought that I was generally quite cool and calm customer when it came to parenting, but there's a question here about the kids are hard to manage in public, and I went off the flipping scale about that one, and I didn't even realise. So it's taught me about my own behaviours, about when my kids kick off in public and to get over it. But it's a really, really, really helpful tool. I'm highlighting the tools here that I think are the most simple to score and the most easy that you can integrate into your practice. There's lots more tools that are a bit more complex in the toolkit. Home conditions assessment I've already talked about, it's excellent. Strengthening difficulties questionnaire, most people would understand it as being called the SDQ, and I've put in here age 4 to 16, you can do it younger. It should be done with the child, depending on their age, the child, the parent and the school. Interestingly, when I talked to the schools yesterday, none of them had heard of it. So we need to be talking about it with schools and using it with schools. What it does is really helps to distinguish those behavioural patterns in children that are concerning and may be indicative of an emerging mental health problem, or something like ADHD or Asperger's or depression, severe anxiety, or actually the presentations are more a behavioural problem, because how you respond to those patterns of behaviour are going to be different. So obviously if you've got emerging, serious depression problems, we're going to need to get a CAMS involved. If it is a behavioural problem, it's about parenting, and we need to be really supporting and doing some parenting interventions. So this SDQ, I can't stress enough how important that is when you're getting a parent that's just really blaming the kid and the kid's behaviour and saying, we need to get some mental health involvement in here. They may be right, but the SDQ helps you to distinguish that.
I have a question, Nicola.
Yeah.
From Jackie Gain, she says, you've mentioned the school, or schools. Do nurseries have access to the neglect documents?
They don't, but they can. So what we're going to do, if they have, we're just about to put it onto C-Zone, so if the nurseries have access to C-Zone, which I don't know actually, but I can talk to you about it afterwards, Jackie, and make sure that that's available. The only reservation I would have is that there are some tools here that probably some of the staff in nurseries shouldn't probably touch doing the mental health screening tools, or they could do the SDQ, but not these screen tools. But let's talk about that. That's really important. They definitely should have access to the neglect matrix. Okay, any other questions? No? Okay. So I've talked, I know you will, yeah. I've talked about the goal attainment scale. Some people may have heard of it as called the GAS. It was a tool that was originally developed with working with people with severe alcohol and substance misuse problems. So Swift practitioners are well used to using this tool. It looks quite simple, it's hard to put into practice. This I've taken from Research in Practice, which is lovely. So normally you get these empty tools, but actually Research in Practice have filled it out to show what an example might look like. So what it is that you have a level of expected outcome about a particular area. It's very outcome focused, and it's graded on much more than expected, most likely outcome, less than expected outcome, and much less than expected. And so, for example, I like goal 2 to talk through. So there's 3 goals there, but goal 2 is that Tom reduces his drinking, gets more involved in basic care. And what they're saying is that, what would that look like? So you sit down with the parent and say, what would that look like in a day-to-day experience for the children and you if that goal was achieved? So if it was more than expected, Tom wouldn't drink alcohol at all, he'd go to all his appointments, he spends more time with his kids, takes more responsibility for their care in the mornings, gives them money to go to the tuck shop. If it's more than expected, Tom is sober most of the time, goes to most of his appointments, finds other ways to relax. Most likely outcome is Tom is sober around the children, goes to his mum's if he wants to get drunk. This probably feels quite familiar because that's the kind of harm minimisation stuff we do. He turns up to most of his appointments at the alcohol service. He spends less than £5 a week on alcohol, and he does not, and I think this is a really good example because it talks about the experience of the children. He does not shout from his bed in the mornings when the children are messing about, and sometimes gets the breakfast. So that really gives you an example of what it feels like if things got better at home. And the thing that all the neglect research will tell you is that often, and sometimes you hear that, don't you, with parents, is that often parents aren't quite clear what's expected of them. What does it mean if the house is improved? What does it mean if the place is tidier? What does it mean if they're looking after their children better? And what we have to avoid, and this forces our hand to align our work with parents, because if we don't align our work with parents, then we're not going to achieve things. What this means is that rather than having plans where we are saying Tom meets all his appointments, the kids go to school every day, Tom might meet all his appointments and the kids may go to school every day, but they're still being shouted at with Tom when Tom is hungover, they're still not getting fed, the house is still really, really dirty. So using this tool, it helps you to really think about the day-to-day experience of the child. So there's a blank tool there. So with all of these tools, you can just photocopy them and take them out and use them with a family. There's a section in the toolkit on intervention, and there's a bit there that talks about cultural competence, and that's an area that I really want to expand. There's not enough in there. It talks about identifying parenting tasks and skills, but actually it's very, very focused about developing parenting tasks and skills, and it breaks down into the individual different areas that parents might be struggling with. For example, they might be struggling with meeting the children's dietary needs, they might be struggling with understanding about their education, and these tools, tasks and skills helps to skill up parents in those particular areas. Talks about, it's got a really good tool called the Resilience Framework, which I'm going to show you now. And at the end of the book, it talks about much more specialist intervention around different forms of neglect, and I'm just going to remind myself what they are. So, for example, it talks about different forms of intervention around emotional unavailability or unresponsiveness. So they talk in particular about parent-infant psychotherapy, which some of our practitioners are beginning to be trained up in, or video guidance, interactive guidance, which is currently being provided by Swift. It also talks about inappropriate developmental expectations,
and like I said, about particular advanced parenting interventions and such as Webster Stratton. I know that we are Holus Bolus doing Triple P now in East Sussex. But Mark Woodgate also delivers training. I don't know if has he got any training at the minute. Mark Woodgate, I will get to deliver some training on parenting toolkits and parenting workshops. So the resilience framework, I'm not sure if any of you have used this or come across it. It's excellent. Angie Hart and Derek Blinko have developed this framework. In the toolkit, it gives you this chart, but it also gives you hyperlinks if you go on it electronically. So under each one of these areas, if you link in online, it gives you tools and approaches to work with the family to address those particular areas. It's really, really good. I would really encourage people to join Boing Boing, which was started off by Angie Hart. It's free, and they often run forums in Hastings looking at different aspects of resilience for children. But the resilience framework talks about what needs to be achieved in order for them to be resilient. It talks about the basics, belonging, learning, coping, and core self. And I think when we're thinking about neglect in particular, it's really important to remind ourselves, for example, if we're not getting the basics right, such as good enough housing, enough money to be fed, being kept safe, having enough sleep, we're never in a million years going to get our children to do any of these learning things. So they're never going to be able to engage with their kids or help other people organise themselves or any of that kind of really lovely stuff that is really important in terms of being a human being if their basic needs are. So this chart sometimes forces us to remind ourselves about that. If we don't sort out their housing, they're not going to get schooled, okay? And I think that when I showed this to the schools in particular, I think the schools were really interested in this. So it would be good to get it out and promoted with them. Okay, so at the back, you'll be glad to know, oh my God, I'm almost on time, Leslie. You'll be glad to know, for you guys that are actually on the webinar, you're probably really interested in research. And so I've got a really good summary at the back of the toolkit, which gives an overview of what the current research is around neglect. There's some really good stuff. Actually, that Ofsted report is really good in the child's time. There's a massive DFE report called Missed Opportunities, Indicators of Neglect. Making a difference to neglected children's experience is really good. And I've drawn heavily on all of those pieces of research in pulling together the toolkit and the neglect strategy. So you may see bits of it thinking, oh, that looks a bit familiar. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. If you want to ask any questions, please do so. My presentation will be made available